Welcome, wee ones, to Scottish Murders. Dawn will shortly be taking you through a solved or unsolved murder involving people from or living in Scotland. So get ready to hear about the darker side of bonnie Scotland.
As this is the second part of this story, I'd recommend listening to part 1 before continuing. For those who have already listened to part 1, I'm just going to give you a wee recap. So far, I've told you about the brutal murders of Francis Barker, Anna Kenny, Hilda Macaulay, Christine Eadie and Helen Scott, Agnes Cooney and Mary Gallagher in 1977 and 1978, with only Francis Barker having received justice thus far, with the other murder cases going cold. I'm going to pick up the story again in the year 2000, 23 years after these horrific murders. It was spring in 2000 and Strathclyde police had received information about a potential suspect of the murder of Mary Gallagher in 1978. This information had come from a particularly reliable source, which in turn prompted a reinvestigation of the case. Information collected back in 1978 was gone through, and evidence that had been carefully collected from the scene, which had thankfully been stored correctly, in the hopes that one day forensics would advance enough to convict someone, was sent for forensic tests. The information that was received from the reliable source was treated so credibly that an investigation into the potential suspect named was also launched. However, all the work put into the suspect named by the reliable witness was blown apart when, due to advances in forensics, a DNA profile was obtained and a match was found on the national database, which was not of the potential suspect they had been investigating. Instead, the match was to 55-year-old Angus Robertson Sinclair, who just so happened to be in prison serving a life sentence. I'm not going to go into the background of Angus Sinclair to a massive degree, as there is so much out there about him already, and I really wanted to remember and highlight the murder victims and their families more. But if you would like to know more about his background, then I'd recommend the books The World's End Murders by Tom Wood and David Johnston, and Gone Fishing by Chris Clark and Adam Lloyd. Angus Robertson Sinclair was born in 1945. He lived with his father, also Angus, his mother Mamie, and his older brother and sister John and Connie in the Maryhill area of Glasgow. When Angus was 4 years old, his father died, having been extremely ill for 2 years with chronic lymphatic leukemia. Angus's mother, Mamie, often wondered if perhaps the loss of his dad at such a young age had somehow contributed to his later behaviour. Angus had always been very small, and as an adult he was only 5 foot 4 inches, or about 1.6 metres, and he'd been bullied at school due to this. He had also been very introverted and not very popular as a boy, and his unpopularity only increased when in 1961, when he was 15 years old, he was sentenced to 3 years probation after being charged and convicted of lewd and libidinous behaviour towards an 8-year-old girl who lived near him, which according to The World's End Murders by Tom Wood and David Johnston is one of the minor charges available for sex offences, and it is usually applied when inappropriate behaviour that falls short of sexual assault has taken place. However, just 6 short months later, Angus Sinclair was arrested for the murder of 7-year-old Catherine Rehill. It was the 1st of July 1961, and Angus was alone at home when he noticed a wee girl playing outside his block of flats. This was a close-knit community, and most people knew each other on sight, but Angus wouldn't have recognised this wee girl, as she was visiting her mum's sister Agnes, who lived in the same block of flats as the Sinclair family, along with her younger siblings Jim and Margaret, while their mum and dad visited London looking for jobs and a property so they could move there and provide a better life for them and their children. Angus left his flat and approached Catherine playing on the street and asked her if she would go to the corner shop for him and buy a bar of chocolate and bring it back to his flat, which she gladly agreed to. However, upon bringing the chocolate to the flat, Angus pulled her inside and attempted to rape her. Catherine must have been terrified, but she put up a good fight as a struggle ensued, which caused Catherine to badly hit her head. Once Angus had overpowered Catherine, he raped her and then strangled her with a bike's inner tube, leaving her fighting for her life. He then proceeded to calmly throw Catherine's lifeless body down the stairs of the block of flats, where she soon was discovered by a couple of women who were going out who thought Catherine had fallen down the stairs. Angus appeared almost immediately and said that he would call an ambulance, telling the operator that a wee girl had fallen down the stairs. Everybody was concentrating so much on trying to save Catherine's life that nobody gave Angus Sinclair a second thought at this time. Catherine sadly died on the way to the hospital. Catherine's mum and dad, Vera and Patrick, were located in London and told the absolutely horrendous news of their daughter's death, and they immediately came back to Glasgow. The entire family were so distressed and still in a state of shock, with Catherine's cousin Anne saying in an article in the Sun newspaper on the 12th of March 2019 that Catherine's horrific death ripped her family apart. She went on to say that he ruined so many lives. My family was never the same. My aunt was never the same. She remembers feeling such anger that her cousin Catherine had been taken from them. Anger was resonated through the family when Angus Sinclair, who ran away from home shortly after Catherine had been taken to hospital, was brought in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the rape and murder of 7-year-old Catherine, but after speaking to his brother John, whose opinion he seemed to value, Angus confessed to murdering Catherine Rehill and was subsequently charged. The community was in shock that not only could such a young boy have committed such an atrocious act, but that he appeared perfectly calm in the minutes afterwards when Catherine had been found on the stairs and he had offered to call an ambulance. Psychiatric reports were carried out before he was sentenced, with the BBC News reporting on the 11th of March 2019 that one psychiatric report said, "I do not think that any form of psychotherapy is likely to benefit his condition, and he will constitute a danger from now onwards. He is obsessed by sex, and given the minimum of opportunity, he will repeat these offences." However, another psychiatrist basically felt that because Angus had acted so normally after the murder, that this in itself showed a degree of abnormality. Following reviewing all of the reports that had been prepared in order for the judge to pass sentence, on the 25th of August 1961, Angus Robertson Sinclair was sentenced to 10 years for culpable homicide, but not murder, as the court believed that Angus Sinclair had diminished responsibility. This in itself left Catherine Rehill's family and many others in outrage. However, they were further disgusted when, after serving only 7 of the 10 years, Angus was released, aged 22 years old. Whilst in prison, he had undergone an apprenticeship in painting and decorating, with the prison services organising day release work for him to reintegrate him back into the community. So upon his release in 1968, Angus, having a job secured in Edinburgh, moved there and found a flat, continuing to work in the job that had been secured for him while still in prison. 2 years later, in 1970, he married a 20-year-old nursing student called Sarah Hamilton, who was the older sister of his friend Gordon Hamilton, who Angus had had a massive falling out with on the day of Gordon's wedding to murder victim Anna Kenny's best friend Wilma Sutherland. Following their wedding, the couple spent their honeymoon in Campbelltown, which lies in the Kintyre Peninsula in western Scotland. And upon their return from honeymoon, the couple made the decision to move to Glasgow, although Angus kept working for the Edinburgh Painting and Decorating Company, meaning he was away from home for long hours. Sarah and Angus had a son 2 years later, who they named Gary. While Sarah said that during their marriage, Angus was always kind to her, he did have numerous extramarital affairs, and she said he would regularly spend his weekends away from home with Sarah's brother Gordon, who had moved in with the couple in 1977, saying that they were going fishing and staying in Angus's white camper van. Although Sarah did say they never came back with any fish. Despite the extramarital affairs and Sarah and Angus having split up a few times, they always got back together. That is until 1982, when Angus Sinclair was arrested and charged with 3 rapes and 9 sexual assaults from 1978 to 1982, with his victims being all girls between the age of 6 and 14. Over a 4-year period, the sexual assault of young girls in specific areas of Glasgow had begun to escalate, and in June of 1982, there being at least 2 attacks in one day. As each of the very young girls were interviewed, the police began to get a clearer picture of who the perpetrator may be. They were always aware of Angus Sinclair due to his past charges against young girls, and when a 6-year-old girl who had been raped at the end of June was shown photos of potential suspects, she clearly picked out Angus Sinclair. This, added with the fact that a number of the girls had said that the perpetrator had smelled of turpentine and one had even noticed paint on their shoes, all led detectives to arriving at Angus Sinclair's home that he had only just purchased with his wife and brought him in for questioning. While he said very little during questioning and denied having any involvement in the sexual assaults, when his wife, Sarah, was asked to sit in on an interview, she said she knew immediately that he was guilty, and so told him that if he was guilty, he should admit it and not put her or their 10-year-old son through a trial. Before Sarah left the interview, Angus admitted that he had carried out so many sexual assaults on young girls that he had lost count, incredibly stating that it could be somewhere between 50 and 500. Angus pled guilty to the sexual assault and rape of 11 children aged between 6 and 14, and in August 1982 he was given a life sentence to serve at least 15 years in prison before being eligible for parole. However, the judge made it very clear that on this occasion he really did recommend that life meant life. Sarah and her 10-year-old son Gary moved to England to start a new life, and while Gary didn't have contact with his dad again for many years, Sarah did keep up sporadic contact and did visit Angus occasionally. However, Gary really suffered with what his dad had done. Not having his dad around anymore and having to move away from his life in Glasgow, he really struggled with. He struggled at school, he struggled to control his temper and would become violent, and he drank heavily. And when he was 22 years old, he was charged with murder, receiving a life sentence and serving 13 years. If you'd like to know more about Gary's life before and after his conviction for murder, you'll find so much more information about this in Gone Fishing by Chris Clark and Adam Lloyd. So, in spring 2000, when a DNA profile matching Angus Sinclair is found on evidence collected in the Mary Gallagher murder, the police are very pleased to find out that he is in prison, and immediately they want to interview him. It turns out that despite the judge recommending at Angus's trial in 1982 for the conviction of rape and sexual assault on children that life should mean life, in 2000, 18 years after his conviction, he had already applied to the parole board to be released in 1999, which had been declined, but this was the usual process, being denied parole the first time around. And so in 2000, Angus was in the process of getting ready to apply to the parole board for a second time to be released. Angus had apparently been a model prisoner. He knew he had to play the game and had happily talked about and had worked through what he had done in his past, and he just wanted to be released so he could start a new life. He knew he had to be seen to be doing anything he possibly could to show that he wanted to cooperate, that he was a changed man, and so when he was asked to give a DNA sample to the police to be added to their ever-growing national DNA database, he happily and voluntarily agreed to provide one. And this very act of cooperation and trying to show he was a changed man was in fact his downfall, when his DNA was matched to semen that had been on one of Mary Gallagher's pubic hairs, who had been murdered in November 1978, with a 1,000,000,000 chance the semen wasn't his. Angus was charged with Mary Gallagher's murder, although he denied any involvement. His trial took place at the High Court in Glasgow in 2001 and lasted 12 days. One of the many witnesses that took to the stand was the now man who had been the 11-year-old boy who had been walking with Mary Gallagher that night but had run away as he had seen a man staring at them so intently that it terrified him. Despite the passage of 23 years and Angus being very much older with greying hair and glasses, the witness could identify that the man he had seen that night had been Angus Sinclair. He had never forgotten the eyes, like dark holes. After 12 days of compelling evidence, the jury took 5 hours to reach a majority verdict of guilty. The judge presiding over the trial said, "This crime was a callous, brutal and depraved act on a young woman for which there is only one sentence which I am allowed to pass in law, and that is one of imprisonment for life." Going on to say that he recommended Angus should spend at least 15 years in jail before being eligible to apply for parole. at which point at least 40 members of Mary Gallagher's family, including her mother, erupted in screaming and hurled abuse at Angus Sinclair. Finally, there had been justice for Mary Gallagher. So now that Angus Sinclair was well and truly on the police's radar, and following him being convicted for the murder of Mary Gallagher, police wanted to find out if it were possible Angus could have been responsible for any other murders in Scotland. And the first cases to be investigated were the murders of Christine Eadie and Helen Scott, known as the World's End Murders. A small team had been set up in 1997 to look through all the evidence collected from the 1977 investigation, and any new lines of inquiry were chased up, one being from an inmate saying that another inmate had told them that they had been involved in the murders and was able to include information that hadn't been disclosed to the public. This new suspect was interviewed and a DNA swab was taken for comparison, as due to advances in forensic technology, one DNA profile had been detected on Helen's jacket, despite Helen and Christine being seen with two men, and detectives truly believed that two men would have been needed to bind the two girls. However, the DNA profile didn't match the DNA taken from the potential suspect. As new leads came in, the police, one by one, ruled out suspects based on their DNA not matching the one found on Helen's jacket. The small team had by this time gone through all of the information taken from back in 1977 and had collated a list of men that not only had been in the World's End pub after 10 p.m. on the evening the girls were last seen, but also a list of every male who had been interviewed or mentioned in the original investigation. Then the task of tracking them all down to ask for a voluntary DNA sample began. However, after completing this task, none of the samples taken matched the DNA sample found on Helen's jacket. At this time, the investigation was wound down briefly until further leads could be generated, everyone believing that this now lay in forensics. As forensics advanced, it was then able to be determined that from the DNA profile that had been recovered from Helen's jacket and semen samples taken from Helen and Christine, that the unidentified male had sex with both girls. It still frequently bothered detectives why only one DNA profile had been found when they were so sure that two men had been involved in these murders. But this question would soon be answered, again due to forensic advances. In 2004, when further tests were carried out on Helen's jacket, scientists were able to clearly extract a second clear DNA sample that was tiny in comparison to the main one they had been working with for years and had been masking the smaller one. And even more exciting for detectives was that the second DNA sample was on the National DNA Profile Database. They had a hit. The full DNA sample that had been found on Helen's jacket was of none other than Angus Robertson Sinclair. After further testing of the knots and tights that had been used to bind the girls, it showed that both DNA profiles were present, albeit Angus Sinclair's was only a partial one. Two men had been involved in Christine and Helen's murders. Now the police just needed to find out who the second person was. It was also noted that perfect reef knots had been used to tie up Christine, and imperfect granny knots had been used to tie up Helen, further backing up the forensics that there had been two men present. Operation Trinity was set up to take the investigation even further, to build a case against Angus Sinclair, to finally find out who the more prominent DNA profile belonged to, as well as determining if Angus Sinclair had been involved in any other murders carried out in Scotland, with the murders of 36-year-old Hilda Macaulay, 20-year-old Anna Kenny, and 23-year-old Agnes Cooney being top of the list. It was concluded that between 1968 and 2003, 1,038 women had been murdered in Scotland. When these were filtered down to those who had been murdered in a similar way to Christine Eadie and Helen Scott, the list not only included Hilda Macaulay, Anna Kenny and Agnes Cooney, but also two Dundee murders, being Carol Lannon and Elizabeth McCabe. However, these two murders were quickly ruled out as having been carried out by Angus, as he had been in prison at the time. However, worryingly, the list also included the name Francis Barker, despite Thomas Ross Young having been found guilty and sentenced to 37 years in 1977. Could Angus and Thomas Ross Young have murdered Francis together, or could there have been a miscarriage of justice? Police did eventually conclude that Angus would have known the areas where all the bodies had been found, as either they were near good fishing sites, and Angus was known to be a keen fisherman, or he had known these sites as a child, and he had even been to Kintyre for his honeymoon, and Kintyre was where Anna Kenny's body was found. All was looking promising so far, but finding the second man who had been involved in the murders of Christine Eadie and Helen Scott was more challenging than had been hoped. Bearing in mind Angus had been in prison since 1982, the police went through his life from this time backwards, and eventually they struck gold. According to the World's End Murders book by Tom Wood and David Johnston, the Y chromosome from the unidentified DNA sample was tested and was determined that it came from the same parental line as the 5 brothers of Sarah Hamilton, Angus's wife. After 4 of her brothers were ruled out, it was determined the second DNA sample found on Helen's jacket, on her body and on the clothing used to bind her was that of Gordon Hamilton, with the odds against it being Gordon being 38 million to 1. However, Gordon was dead, having died in 1996. But the police were positive they had identified the second man. The police weren't immediately able to corroborate this DNA being Gordon's, as since his death 6 years previous, his family had thrown out every last thing he had touched or owned, and his body had been cremated. However, through some great police work and determination, it was discovered that Gordon had carried out some odd jobs for friends and relatives, and a few years before he had died, he had decorated a relative's home. The relative advised the police that Gordon had also put a coving up for her, and so the police sought permission to remove a section of the coving to test. And lo and behold, DNA was found which matched the DNA that had been found on Helen's jacket. They had him. Gordon had met Angus after his sister Sarah had married him, but apparently they didn't spend a lot of time together. It was Sarah's younger brother David who spent a lot more time with Angus. However, Gordon did live with Sarah and Angus in 1977 before meeting and marrying Anna Kenny's best friend, Wilma Sutherland, in 1978. Following Gordon and Wilma divorcing, Gordon had taken to drink and ended up homeless, dying from a heart attack in 1996. Now, there had been another line of inquiry that the police had been keen to investigate when it had been established that the DNA found had been that of Angus Sinclair. They had been keen to track down the white camper van Angus had had in 1977 when he and Gordon used to say that they were going fishing, as when officers had gone back over the information from the murders back in 1977, it was noted that some witnesses had mentioned seeing a white camper van near either where the girls had last been seen or near where the girls had been found. Apparently, Angus had quickly sold on the white camper van after the murder of Agnes Cooney in December 1977. But the police were able to trace that the camper van had last been owned by a couple in Scotland who had done some renovations to the outside of the camper van over the years, but amazingly they had never altered the inside, including it still having the original seat covers. The police were so hopeful of finding DNA samples of the other women who had been murdered too, as they really wanted Angus Sinclair to be charged with all of the murders on their list. However, the police were 6 months too late. 6 months previously, the couple had scrapped the camper van. And just like that, the hope of being able to charge Angus Sinclair with all 6 murders was gone. As not only had the camper van been lost, but so had all the paperwork from back in 1977 from the investigation into the murders of Hilda Macaulay, Anna Kenny, and Agnes Cooney. Gone, either lost or destroyed. But not only that, there was also the possibility that a miscarriage of justice had taken place back in 1977 when Thomas Ross Young was convicted of the murder of Frances Barker. So, as the investigation into the Glasgow murders was only circumstantial due to the lack of information and of the possible miscarriage of justice, it was decided that Angus Sinclair would only be charged with the murders of Christine Eadie and Helen Scott, for which he was charged in spring of 2005, with the trial beginning on the 6th of August 2007. From 2005 until the trial in 2007, detectives spent months and months, hours at a time interviewing Angus, a lot of the time receiving in reply only a no comment. But despite this, the police continued to build what they felt was a strong case against Angus Sinclair. However, by the time the trial came around in 2007, not many were feeling very confident about securing a conviction, as not only had the partial DNA sample that had been found in the knots used to bind the girls been decided too tenuous to present at court, but also the fact that there had been 2 different knot styles used on each girl. Due to this, it also meant that experts in these fields would no longer be called. Plus, what was initially going to be a 6-week trial was at the last minute cut down to only 2 weeks by the court. Detectives and the Crown Office team prosecuting were feeling very nervous. Angus filed a special defence, saying that it was his dead brother-in-law Gordon who had carried out the murders, and that any DNA found on or in the girls' bodies was due to consensual sex. The prosecution did their absolute best to present a strong case, but with the partial DNA, knots and experts not being admissible, as well as the fact that the jury were not allowed to be told of Angus's previous convictions for rape and murder, sadly their case fell well short and the trial wouldn't even last the 2 weeks. The defence motioned for a no case to answer, which the judge agreed to, and the case against Angus Sinclair was dismissed. And that was it. After years of investigative work, of all the information that had been collected, of the DNA samples that had been retrieved, of all the effort that had been put in by everyone. And of course, after the family of Christine Eadie and Helen Scott had got their hopes up that finally they would receive justice, just like that, everyone's hopes were dashed. Outside the courtroom, after hearing that his hopes of having his daughter see justice had been shot down, Helen's dad, 77-year-old Moraine Scott, said, "I am absolutely shattered. Words can't explain how I feel. I am gutted, absolutely gutted." He went on to say that he did not feel that he had received justice and that he was convinced Angus Sinclair had been involved somehow. But Mr. Moraine and everyone else who had been involved in this case would soon have their hopes lifted once again.
Hi guys, now we're going to play a little extract from the Fuck My Work Life podcast with your hosts Jay and Kay. Enjoy!
Have you ever had a bad day at work?
If so, then the Fuck My Work Life podcast is perfect for you.
I'm Jay.
And I'm Kay.
And we share listener stories from the workplace, whether they're funny, weird, or horrifying.
They are always entertaining and will leave you feeling like maybe you don't have it so bad after all.
Find us on your favorite podcast app, but you may have to type in F***K My Work Life.
Because we're the idiots that put fuck in the title of our podcast.
And follow us on all the socials at FMWL Pod.
Can't wait to hear your stories.
And now, on with the story. While it is likely Angus Sinclair believed that that was it, it was over. He couldn't be tried for Helen or Christine's murder again. He'd gotten away with it. Little did he know just what his case being dismissed would stir up. As word spread, everybody was annoyed and disgusted by what had happened. The decision taken by the judge to dismiss the case and not leave the decision to a jury was called into question. Members of Scottish Parliament expressed their opinions, debates took place, conversations were had about the double jeopardy law and rules. Everybody had something to say on the matter. And so, in November 2011, the retrospective Double Jeopardy Scotland Act 2011 legislation was passed by Parliament, meaning that if there was new evidence brought forward that the person committed the original offence or similar, then, if granted by the Crown, a new prosecution could be brought. This was great news. However, now new evidence had to be found, and again it would be cutting-edge forensics that would be relied on. This time, the tights and bras that had been knotted and used to bind Christine and Helen were fully unravelled for the first time. As before, it wasn't felt that forensics would be able to detect what lay in the folds and creases of the clothing. But now, with the latest advances in forensics, when the binds were unfolded, traces of Helen's, Christine's, Gordon's and Angus's DNA were found there, indicating that they had got there when the clothing had been ripped off and used to bind the girls. not looking like the consensual sex Angus Sinclair had suggested. This was the new evidence that they had been looking for, which the Crown agreed was satisfactory to instigate a further trial. And so Angus Sinclair found himself back in court on the 13th of October 2014 as the first case to be heard under the new double jeopardy law. And this time the prosecution were given 5 weeks to present every single piece of not only new evidence, but evidence they hadn't been allowed to present in the previous trial, as well as many experts in every possible area. Angus Sinclair also took to the stand himself, but did nothing to endear the jury to him. If you would like to know more about what transpired during the trial, you can find so much more information from the Gone Fishing book and a week-by-week account in the World's End Murders book. On the 14th of November 2014, after closing statements and direction by the judge, the jury retired. However, they only took 2 hours to find Angus Sinclair unanimously guilty of the murders of Christine Eadie and Helen Scott. The judge presiding over the trial condemned Angus for what he had done, for the horrendous act he had carried out on these young girls, of the torment he has subsequently caused their families. He then said that he wasn't going to waste his words on Angus and handed down a life sentence, with the punishment part to be a minimum of 37 years, which was very apt, as it was just over 37 years since the murders of both Christine and Helen. The judge basically said he handed down this very lengthy sentence as he wanted to ensure that this man would not have a chance of ever getting paroled, as Angus Sinclair would be 106 years old when he would be eligible. He was then led away. He was 69 years old. According to the BBC News, on the 14th of November 2014, Helen's brother, Kevin, said outside of the court that, "We finally have justice for Helen and Christine," going on to say that the 37-year sentence was appropriate. He went on to describe his sister Helen as a country girl, who had beautiful blue eyes and a smile that he would never forget. He said that Christine was popular, friendly, and a likeable girl, and that her family loved her dearly. Helen's dad, Morton, who was 84 years old, was also outside of the court with his son Kevin. Morton had made a promise to his wife just before she died that he would get justice for their daughter. He felt that he had fulfilled that promise and just wanted to go on with his life now. Sadly, Morton died the following year, but he was at peace, finally having got justice for his little girl. There never was an inquiry into whether Thomas Ross Young was innocent of Francis Barker's murder, or if he had acted with Angus, and Thomas Ross Young died in 2014 still saying he was innocent. Did Francis get justice? Gordon Hamilton died before being brought to justice for his part in the rape of Christine Eadie and Helen Scott, as well as their potential murder, and due to this he tends to get forgotten about. But Helen and Christine were abducted, bound, tortured and raped by both Gordon and Angus, and murdered by Angus and potentially Gordon too. Despite Operation Trinity being set up and establishing that Hilda Macaulay, Anna Kenny and Agnes Cooney had been murdered in a similar way to Christine Eadie and Helen Scott, and therefore it being possible that Angus Sinclair had also murdered them, sadly there was no evidence left from their murder inquiries to be able to prove this one way or another. Hilda, Anna and Agnes will therefore never receive justice. But it is thanks to the careful storage of all documentation and evidence collected in the Christine Eadie and Helen Scott murders that they were able to receive justice, despite the passage of time. There may very well also have been more women murdered in Scotland, either by Angus Sinclair or Gordon Hamilton, that was never discovered. And finally, Angus Sinclair died on the 11th of March 2019, following suffering a series of strokes, after his health had deteriorated over an 18-month period, where he had progressively been unable to walk, he needed assistance with personal hygiene and dressing, was at risk of falls, and had increasing periods of incontinence. He was 73 years old. Like I said at the beginning, so much of the information for these cases came from 2 books, one being Gone Fishing by Chris Clark and Adam Lloyd, and the second being The World's End Murders by Tom Wood and David Johnson. Synopsis and links to both books and all other source material can be found under this episode on our website, scottishmurders.com. There is so much more information in these books that I wasn't able to say in the episodes, including the belief that not only did Angus Sinclair carry out all of the murders mentioned in these episodes, but also potentially more. So, were these murders linked or not linked? I'd like to believe that they were linked and that Angus and or Gordon committed them, as if it wasn't either of these men, then there is someone else out there who committed these terrible crimes and got away with it. I hope you've enjoyed these 2-part episodes, but don't forget that there's also a general chat with myself and Scottish comedian, actor and writer Eleanor Morton still to come, which will be available a week after this episode is released.
Scottish Murders is a production of Cluarantonn.